She called me Pip. Not Phoebe. Not Miss Alderton, which would have been the reasonable way to address a stranger. She said it the way someone says a name they've said 100 times before. Easy, familiar, with no awareness that it should require an explanation. She was standing at the end of the driveway in a green cardigan, watching me carry boxes from the rented Chevrolet, and that was the first thing out of her mouth. I set the box down on the porch step. My father had called me Pip. He'd started it when I was 4 years old and couldn't say Phoebe cleanly yet, and what came out was something closer to Pip, and it had stuck. Not my mother, not my brother. Not a single person from school or from work or from the 11 years of adult life I'd built in Toronto had ever called me that. It had belonged entirely to him, and he had been dead for 5 months. My name is Phoebe Alderton, and I am 33 years old, and last September I drove 7 hours north from Toronto, with everything I'd kept from my apartment loaded into the back of a rented Chevrolet, to move into a house I had never visited, in a town I had never lived in, because a notary named Gideon Price had called me in July, and left a voicemail I listened to 3 times before I understood what he was saying. My father had left me his childhood home. A house on a gravel road called Creston Line outside the town of Barrowfield, Ontario, that I hadn't known he still owned, that I hadn't known he'd meant for me to have, because I hadn't known anything about what my father had meant or thought or planned for the last 11 years of his life. I hadn't known he was ill. I hadn't known he'd had a stroke in June, or that he'd been in a care facility in Peterborough since the previous winter, or that he'd been managing his affairs from a hospital bed, quietly and without telling me, because 11 years ago I had stopped speaking to him. Or so I had believed. My mother had told me, when I was 22 and standing in her kitchen in Whitby with a cup of tea going cold in my hands, that my father had chosen a version of his life that didn't include us. She said it gently, the way she said difficult things, with her hands wrapped around her own cup, and her voice very steady. She said she thought the kindest thing I could do for myself was to stop waiting for a man who had already made his choice. I had believed her, the way you believe something when the person telling you it loves you and has no reason to lie. For 11 years I had believed her. The house on Creston Line was 2 stories with white clapboard siding and a wraparound porch that needed paint. The garden had been beautiful once, and was now mostly goldenrod and wild aster, which have their own particular charm when you're prepared for them. Across the gravel road sat a cedar bungalow with a hand-painted mailbox and window boxes that still had petunias in them even in late September. The woman who lived there came over on my second day with a container of soup and introduced herself by her surname only. Wyndham. The way people in small Ontario towns introduce themselves when they've already decided you'll be on familiar terms soon enough. And then she called me Pip. I didn't ask her about it that afternoon. I had boxes to carry, and a refrigerator to stock and a furnace to figure out, and I told myself there was an explanation. My father had mentioned me to the neighbors, perhaps. He'd used an old habit when he said his daughter's name. The nickname wasn't as private as I'd always assumed. I was good at talking myself out of things. My ex-husband used to say I could rationalize my way out of a sealed room, and he didn't mean it as a compliment. I told myself that for 11 days. Then, in early October, my neighbor came to the door with a jar of preserves from a farmer's market she'd been to, and while I thanked her on the doorstep, she looked past me into the kitchen and said, "Good to see the bird feeder still up. Your father always put black oil sunflower seeds in it." Said the cardinals came every morning without fail. I had not told anyone in Barrowfield that I was his daughter. The property had transferred under the estate name and my own name, but I had not mentioned who I was beyond that. The connection was not obvious. She knew anyway. I bought a small notebook the next morning at the pharmacy on the main street, and I kept it on the kitchen table, beside the kettle. Dated entries. I had spent 9 years as a classroom teacher before I burned out and took a leave of absence, and the habit of documentation is one that sticks. The version of an event you reconstruct from memory is always softer than the version you wrote down when it happened. Always missing the one sharp detail that matters. Over the following 6 weeks, I filled 43 pages. My neighbor knew that my father had kept his good rain jacket on the hook by the back door and the old one by the front. She knew the name of the stuffed rabbit I'd had from age 2 to 9. Dobbin. After the horse in a book my father had read to me every winter when I was small, and she mentioned it so casually in the middle of a sentence about whether I'd found the extra blankets in the hall closet that I nearly missed it. I didn't miss it. She mentioned the specific plaid of a flannel shirt my father had owned. She mentioned the way he took his tea. She mentioned the cardinals, repeatedly, with the particular fondness of someone who had watched them with him. By November, I had run out of innocent explanations. I contacted a private investigator in Peterborough, whose name came from a former colleague who had used her in a landlord dispute and described her as expensive, thorough, and worth every dollar of both. Her name was Constance Osei, and she worked from an office on Hunter Street, and she listened to everything I told her without interrupting, which I have since come to understand is a professional skill and not a personality trait, though in her case I suspect it may be both. I paid a $2,200 retainer, and she told me the full engagement would run to $3,500 CAD, give or take, depending on what she found. Her first report arrived 3 weeks later. It told me the obvious. My neighbor was 74 years old, widowed in 2011, no criminal record, no civil disputes on file. She had lived across from my father's house for 37 years and had retired in 2009 after 30 years as a legal secretary at a firm in Lindsay called Price & Aldworth. I had to read that name twice. Gideon Price, the notary who had called me about my father's will. His father had founded that firm. My neighbor had worked there for 3 decades, and according to Constance's second report, which arrived 6 weeks after the first, and which I read standing at the kitchen counter in my coat because I hadn't bothered to take it off, she had been assigned in her final years at the firm primarily to estate and personal property files, including, as Constance confirmed after a records request that required a formal disclosure authorization I had reviewed by a lawyer in Lindsay, my father's. She had managed his file, and in 2010, my father had registered a sealed personal deposit at Price & Aldworth with a specific set of instructions attached. The deposit was to be transferred to my neighbor upon the conveyance of the property on Creston Line to a named beneficiary. I was the named beneficiary. I had come back to this house. He had been waiting, with whatever was inside that deposit, for exactly this. I did not go to my neighbor that week or the week after. I have learned, not from therapy, though I've had enough of it, and not from books, though I've read enough of those too, that the moments when you most urgently want to go straight at something are usually the moments when you most need to wait and get the whole shape of it first. I had a partial picture and I needed the rest before I said a single word. I asked Constance to do one more thing. I asked her to find out whether there was any evidence of communication. During the 11 years my father and I hadn't spoken, between my father and my mother. Not because I had a specific suspicion, because I had begun quietly and against my will to have a general one, a shape forming at the edge of what I could see clearly. It took her 3 more weeks and access to the physical archives at Price & Aldworth, which Gideon Price authorized after I signed a second disclosure. What she found was this: 17 letters, written by my father, 1 per year across 11 years, each addressed to me at my mother's house in Whitby. One of them sent every year, year after year, to the same address, none of them marked as delivered. All 17, as far as Constance could reconstruct from the records, had been returned to the firm. A single piece of paper found at the back of the archive held the explanation. The covering note was handwritten. I know my mother's handwriting the way I know my own face. Looping, slightly backward slanting, the particular way she forms her R's, that I noticed when I was 8, and learning to write and noticed again when I was 12. Reading a note she'd left on the kitchen counter and noticed again now. Looking at a photocopy of a page that had been sitting in a filing cabinet in Lindsay for years. The note said, "She has made her feelings clear. Please do not send further correspondence." I had made no such feelings clear. I had never seen one envelope. I drove to Whitby on a Friday in January. The 1:15 was too icy that morning, so I took the 407 and added 40 minutes each way, which gave me a long time to think, and then to stop thinking, and then to think again. My mother knew I was coming. She had made tea and set out the shortbread tin, the same tin, I am fairly certain, that has sat on the same shelf in her kitchen since I was a child, and we sat at the kitchen table across from each other the way we always have, the ways we sat when she told me at 22 that my father had made his choice. I put the photocopied note on the table between us. She looked at it without touching it. She picked up her mug. She set it down. She said she had thought she was protecting me. She said that after the separation I had been so hurt that every time she'd thought about telling me a letter had arrived, she'd imagined my face, and she hadn't been able to bear it. She said she had made a decision for me at a time when I wasn't in a position to make it well myself. I told her I had never seen a single one of those letters. Not one. That every year for 11 years my father had written to me, and every year she had sent the words back unopened, with a note claiming I had asked her to. I told her that I had spent 11 years believing my father had gone silent by choice, and that he had died in June, in a room in Peterborough that I hadn't known he was in, without ever knowing whether his daughter had read a word he'd sent her. She didn't say anything for a long time. Through the kitchen window, the old birch tree in the backyard was bare, and the bird feeder my father had installed in that tree when I was 6 was still there, still full of seed. She'd kept it filled. I don't know what to do with that. I thought it would get easier, she said finally, for both of you, with time. I told her that he had died not knowing, that some things don't get easier with time. They just become the shape of the room you live in, and you stop noticing the walls. I drove home to Barrowfield in the dark, 4.5 hours on winter roads, and when I came down Creston Line and pulled into the driveway, the light was on in the cedar bungalow across the street. My neighbor came to my door on a Saturday morning 8 days later, no phone call ahead. She stood on the porch in her green cardigan, and she was holding a cedar box about the size of a shoebox, the corners worn soft, the brass clasp gone green. She said, "Your father asked me to wait until you were ready. I thought perhaps you were ready now." I asked her how she knew. She said, "Because you came back from wherever you went, and the light in your kitchen was on past midnight. He used to do the same thing when he was working something out." I stepped back and let her in. We sat at the kitchen table. She set the box between us. The clasp opened on the first try, the way old things open when they've been waiting long enough. Inside were 17 envelopes, each one unsealed, each one dated lightly in pencil in the upper right corner, each one addressed to me at my mother's house, in my father's handwriting. These were his copies. He had kept a copy of every letter he'd sent, in order, so that if the originals never came back to him, and he had known, she told me, that the originals were gone, he had understood it by the 3rd or 4th year and had kept writing anyway. The record would exist somewhere. He had kept writing because, she said it simply and without drama, he was that kind of man. He had driven to Barrowfield in October 2020 and given the box to her in person. He had told her then about the diagnosis. She had not told me this when we first met, because she had wanted to give me time to find my way to it. She said she was sorry if she'd frightened me with the things she'd mentioned in the early weeks. She said she'd been holding 11 years of a man's descriptions of his daughter, and sometimes it had simply come out. He had described the rabbit. He had described the bird feeder and the tea and the rain jacket and the flannel shirt. He had told her about the skating accident when I was 11, about driving me to the hospital and reading aloud from a waiting room magazine for 3 hours until I fell asleep in the plastic chair beside him. He had kept a photograph of me at 8 or 9 years old, squinting into a summer afternoon in the back garden of this house, holding Dobbin. She handed it to me from the front pocket of the box. I don't know how he got it. I sat with it in my hands for a long time. She left the cedar box on my table and walked back across the road. I didn't open the letters that afternoon. I made tea and sat with the box in front of me, and did nothing else until the light changed. I read all 17 on a Sunday in late February at the kitchen table, from early morning until the winter afternoon went gray and thin. The letters were not what I had prepared myself for. I had been ready for grief and accusation, for the compressed anger of a man who had been shut out of his own daughter's life. There was none of that. They were the letters of someone who had decided that, if he could not be present, he would at least be honest about the passing of time. He wrote about the house, about the repairs he'd done and the ones he'd put off, about the garden surrendering to goldenrod, and how he'd eventually decided to let it. He asked about my teaching, the way you ask, about the life of someone you're not allowed to observe directly, but refuse to stop being interested in. In one letter, the 6th one, he wrote that he had driven past my school one afternoon and sat in his car on the street for 20 minutes without going in. He wrote that he had seen me come out a side door carrying groceries, wearing a red coat, my hair back, walking very fast the way I've always walked when something is on my mind. He wrote that he had not rolled down the window, or called out or done anything at all, except sit there and watch me turn the corner. And then he had driven home and cried in a Tim Hortons parking lot for longer than he was proud of, which he wrote he hoped I would find at least a little bit funny, knowing him. I did find it a little funny. I also couldn't see the page for a while. In the last letter, written that final autumn, he had left one paragraph I have read enough times, now that I no longer need the paper in front of me to say it. I have no way of knowing if anything I've sent you over the years has ever reached you. I have suspected for some time that it hasn't. But I want the record to reflect the truth somewhere. The silence you may have experienced as mine was never mine. I chose to speak to you every year for 11 years. The words simply could not get past your front door. That is not a failure of love. Whatever shape this story has taken in your memory of me, I need you to understand that. The silence was not mine. I called my neighbor on a Tuesday evening and asked if she would come for dinner. She came on Thursday. I made pasta from a recipe she mentioned he had liked. We sat at the kitchen table for nearly 3 hours and she talked about my father the way you talk about someone you have genuinely loved. Not a performance, not a summary, but specific things. The way he laughed at his own jokes before he finished them. The argument he had with himself every spring about whether to plant tomatoes, which he always lost. The particular way he left books face down, which she had scolded him for, and which he had never stopped doing. I listened to every word and asked questions when I had them. I have not resolved things with my mother. I have had 2 more conversations with her in Whitby since January, and in both of them she has returned to the word protection, the way someone returns to familiar ground when everything else feels uncertain. I understand her reasons the way you can understand something and still find it insufficient. Forgiveness, I've decided, is not a gate you walk through once and leave behind. It is a practice. Some days I am closer to it than others. What I know is that the house on Creston Line is mine, and I am staying in it. The cedar box is on the bookshelf in the living room. The green mug with the pine tree on it, which my neighbor brought over in November, because she said my father had told her it was mine, sits on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, where I can see it while I do the dishes. Last spring, on an afternoon in May when the tulip bulbs I'd planted in November, without expecting much, had done something remarkable with the front beds, I was kneeling in the garden pulling dead growth from around the new stems when I noticed I was wearing my father's canvas hat. The one that had been hanging on the hook by the back porch when I arrived. I'd started putting it on without thinking about it sometime in March. It was too large. I'd taken to folding up the brim on one side to keep it from sliding forward over my eyes. I stayed in the garden until the light went. Then I went inside and made tea the way she had told me he always made it. 2 sugars, a splash of milk, not cream, and I stood at the kitchen window and watched the cardinal in the birch tree across the road, and the light was on in the cedar bungalow. And I thought about a man who had driven to this town one October afternoon to leave a box of copies with an old woman across the road, just in case his daughter came back to the house someday. She called me Pip the first morning we met, and I understand now it was because he had told her, over 11 years of letters and conversations she had kept safe for me, that Pip was my name, that it had always been my name, and that he had never once stopped using it.